Hey, hello, I'm Wren Ribeiro, and I want to connect with you about peace and justice. We are interviewing women who labor for peace, as we have forever and always will, until we all feel peace in our homes, our workplaces, our communities, and especially our bodies and minds. This initiative is named Mujéres Co-Labor for Peace. It's a show of intimate conversations with justice workers who are healing their self and communities from the effects of misogyny, capitalism, and climate change. Welcome to the show. I'm Wren Ribeiro, and I wish you complete wellness and lasting peace. Mujéres Co-Labor for Peace is about taking steps, however small, to heal the effects of misogyny, capitalism, and climate change. This is our 10th episode, but it's number 9 because we had a bonus episode 1.5 early on. I may stop noting the episode numbers, but right now it feels great to get to number 10. 10 steps toward healing. We just heard from 2 leaders in the cooperative space in Massachusetts, and before we transition to a few rich episodes about rediscovering European indigeneity, psychological safety, healing from religious dogma, and healing with the land, I want to insert an important episode on Black capitalism from a couple of perspectives. My growing wish is for you to explore and reflect upon some important topics that you might not otherwise immerse yourself in, and that afterwards you feel a bit more inspired and peaceful about life. We begin each episode with an inquiry of the self, asking ourselves, how is this beating heart? And right now, my heart is feeling a bit neglected. How is your heart? Now let's take a lung-expanding breath together. The intimate conversation today is about understanding lasting impacts of capitalism. We explored a few of the big themes of capitalism in episode 6, lending, public banking, and profit-seeking, like the too big to fail banks that were bailed out with tax dollars in 2008. Today, we'll delve into an emotional PhD level of capitalism. Perhaps it is no coincidence that I am preparing for this show on the same day that Reverend Dr. Liz Theo-Harris and Bishop William Barber are hosting a rally at the 54th Regiment Memorial in Boston Common, while simultaneously hosting rallies with leaders at 31 other state capitals. Their Poor People's Campaign is focused on holding policymakers accountable for the policy violence against impoverished Americans, including 2,342,000 poor and low-income folks in Massachusetts. They are building a third Reconstruction to, among many demands, abolish poverty as the 4th leading cause of death in the United States. Poverty. Also likely a major factor in some of the other leading causes of death, like heart disease, cancer, stroke, and respiratory diseases. Healing the effects of capitalism begins with understanding. There are 2 women spotlighted in today's episode. One is Patrice Kahn-Cullors, co-founder of Black Lives Matter and a prison abolitionist in Los Angeles, through the Dignity and Power Now organization she founded, and the Coalition to End Sheriff Violence in LA Jails. She served there as executive director. I have just read her biography, When They Call You a Terrorist, and I look forward to reading her abolition handbook, 12 Steps to Changing Yourself and the World. The other woman spotlighted is Mahersa Baradaran, the author of The Color of Money, which is praised in a book review stating, Baradaran's point is to show how white and black Americans effectively live in two separate economies. As a work of history, the book contains a disturbingly coherent narrative of racist plunder spanning from the Freedmen's Bureau Bank in 1865 to today's payday lenders. Baradarian's book is a must-read for anyone interested in closing America's racial wealth gap. Hopefully everyone. Another review states, Baradarian's brilliant and devastating analysis leads to an irrefutable conclusion. The racial wealth gap is the product of state law and public policy and will only be reversed when the same governmental tools that created segregation and discrimination are deployed to end it. Remember that tax-funded big bank bailout in 2008? Baradarian's research reveals that this crisis devoured more than half of the wealth of the black community, quote, proving once again the adage that when Wall Street catches a cold, Harlem gets pneumonia. In Patrisse Culler's book, When They Call You a Terrorist, we learn that a human is killed by a police officer in California every 72 hours. She expands on the Poor People's Campaign statistic about poverty as a leading cause of death by stating that there are no data about the collateral deaths from months and years of grief spent mourning, or the depression that becomes addiction, that becomes cirrhosis, or diabetes that becomes a fatal stroke. Culler's home and her partner was assaulted by the police in the middle of the night after she co-founded Black Lives Matter. But the terrorism her father and brother experienced, along with numerous friends and other humans she shares stories of in her book, are what keep her rising up and overcoming incredible hurdles. She leaves us with 4 definitions of terrorism based on this lived experience. 1, terrorism is being stalked and surveilled simply because you are alive. 2, and terrorism is being put in solitary confinement and starved and beaten. 3, and terrorism is not being able to feed your children despite working 3 jobs. 4, and terrorism is not having a decent school or a place to play. The solitary confinement, starvation, and beatings her brother Monty survived, not to mention the denial of and wrongful medications that exacerbated his mental illness, were the result of a fender bender. He yelled at a white woman who called the police, who beat him so badly he needed hospitalization. It was one devastation after another, where there is no margin for error. If you understand anything about the prison industrial complex, you know that it is first and foremost an institution of economics. What Monty endured is beyond gut-wrenching. I have family members with mental illness who have had fender benders, but also have the privilege of being white. When Cullers describes being at a court hearing for her brother and seeing his strapped down, emaciated body wheeled out on a stretcher and hearing him cry out for his mother, I sobbed. I'm about to sob again. After she had time to process her own experience, she writes, "Is this what it is to be a mother who has to carry the weight of having to protect her children in a world that is conspiring to kill them? Are you forced to exist within a terrible trinary of emotion, rage, grief, or guilt? What of the joy and peace that loving a child brings? What of pride and hope?
Take a break.
Is she one in a long line of Black mothers limited to survival mode or grief? Is my mother the fallout, the collateral damage in the battle to elevate personal responsibility over everything, over all those decisions that were made about state budget priorities, about wages, about the presence of police, and even about damn grocery stores and access to food quality? Let's really talk about and share these lived stories. There is so much more to say here. And Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, has a 10th anniversary edition available. Let's read that. One high-level response to this extreme level of racialized economic inequality has been to create Black-owned and run banks in the spirit of, quote, Black capitalism, on which Richard Nixon's civil rights platform was centered. Killer Mike and Ryan Glover are founders of Greenwood, a financial system for circulating Black money that acts like a bank but is not technically a bank. Super creative. The issue with banking is deep and gnarly, and I am glad that I infiltrated banking years ago so that I can appreciate the creativity it takes to do right by the Black community. In contrast to the temporarily segregated banks created by Italian, Jewish, German, Irish, and Asian immigrants, Blacks were not granted formative, government-guaranteed low-interest mortgage loans, nor welcomed to settle into suburbs. This includes the GI Bill benefits that were not granted to the 1.2 million Black veterans. Literally only 0.7% of Black veterans were able to access the benefits that granted free college and home ownership to a generation of mostly white veterans, paid for with roughly 50% of the U.S. budget at that time. The Bank of Italy merged into mainstream U.S. banking, like many others, and is now the Bank of America. Unlike Black Americans, white passing immigrants eventually left their overcrowded ghettos and settled into suburbs that barred Blacks through acts of violence, racial covenants, and zoning restrictions like redlining. Again, healing the effects of capitalism requires all white identified people to understand this political undercurrent of the flow, the currency, and power of money. Mahersa Baradaran's book, The Color of Money, explains that the market fundamentalists' narrative about some invisible hand setting the price of Black credit or the value of Black homes is instead a coercive hand of the state that has consistently excluded Blacks from full participation in American capitalism. Hers is, quote, a story of economics, politics, and laws that sowed the seeds of injustice into the soil of the American economy. This book looks closely at slavery as the foundation of American capitalism, when 3.2 million slaves were worth nearly the entire gross national product of $1.3 billion. It reveals critical imbalances of accounting, including the 150 years of wealth stagnation for Black families since the Emancipation Proclamation signed in 1863, and the fact that 60% of the Black population is unbanked or underbanked, in contrast to 20% of the white population. Wren says it is too simplistic to blame the racists or the loan sharks for the wealth gap, and that whether the next century yields a different result will depend in part on understanding the nature of the failures of the last century. These details from Patrice Kahn-Kullers and Mahersa Baradaran are just scratching the surface of Black capitalism. We'll shift gears for a few episodes to hear from guests more generally about healing, including through ceremony and ancestry, through unpacking the emotional impacts of religious dogma, and what psychological safety means. But we'll close today with an inspiring and inspired organization in Minneapolis called REP, Relationships Evolving Possibilities. It's a network of dedicated abolitionists showing up to support others in moments of crisis or urgency, with care and respect for the full dignity and autonomy of the people in crisis. They have a hotline and revolutionary emergency partners, as well as radical ecosystem pods. I love it when folks build up their acronyms with meaning. And I love this belief that as a community, we have the ability and capacity to love and protect each other without giving our agency to systems that were built to destroy, consume, or commodify us. Thank you for engaging with the emotional weight of this episode and for breathing through it. Join me for more of this conversation about healing the effects of misogyny, capitalism, and climate change next time on Mujéres Co-Labor for Peace. I am Wren Ribeiro, and I thank you for joining. This initiative is supported by InnerFortune, the full-life self-coaching journal that is now digital. Join us for peace, and thank you for your heart.